We're in Psalm 16 this morning. Pastor mentioned this for it's very possible for all of us to find ourselves as we enter into a week that you know is going to be a week of revival meetings. And we've phrased it that way, named it that way, because historically our desire and our intention as we enter into a week like this is we want to be revived. The word revive, life again. And sometimes we think that looks like the Second Great Awakening, and if it looks like the Second Great Awakening, you've never seen it, and I have never seen it in my time. But let us not confuse the Second Great Awakening, though that was revival, with what the Lord wants to do here. Hey, the Lord wants to start the Third Great Awakening in this church this week. Let it be so. But the simplicity of what revival is falling in love with Jesus all over again, where the church is brought back to a state of normality. Not what we've been living, but a state of normality, which is biblical Christianity. And every single one of us, preacher included, needs to go deeper, needs to come to a new place of brokenness, and needs to see Jesus lifted up in a fresh and new way so that flesh would be crucified, Christ would be lifted up, and I would be drawn to Him. So as a preacher, it is my desire that I would lift up Christ, because only Christ can give new life. And I would encourage and invite and really plead with you that as we start these special meetings, that you would not just view this as 3 or 4 or 5 services of maybe a good preacher, hopefully, but instead say, now Lord, what do you want to teach me? The authority behind this desk is not in my age. The authority is not in my experience. The authority is in the Word. And the reviving will come through the Spirit working through the living Word in your living soul. So let us ask the Spirit to do that. As we look at these services, we're going to begin. I believe I was praying this morning, and I thought maybe the Lord was going to lead a different direction, and the Lord led back to this passage here. This morning's service from Psalm 16 is really going to kick off what I believe the Lord wants to do in our hearts. I mentioned a minute ago, revival is the church falling in love with Jesus all over again. That's not original with me. It's another preacher from the past, but that has helped me very much in realizing that I need a fresh glimpse of who Christ is. I want to ask you a question before we jump into this passage. Is it important to look at the Scriptures and discover what God can do? You tell me. Yes, it absolutely is. In fact, when a people forgets what God can do, they will forget God. It's why in the Old Testament, God constantly told His people, the parents especially, teach your children, teach your grandchildren what I have done, because if you don't know what I have done, you'll miss who I am. But is just knowing what God can do, is that the end all? Or is it important to also know who Christ is? Let me put it this way. Is it more important, you tell me, I want you to think about this, is it more important to know what God can do, or is it more important to know who God is? Someone give me your thoughts. Okay, why?
Because if we know who God is, then we know what we can do, what we're supposed to do for Him.
Okay.
We're supposed to worship Him.
Yes, that'd be accurate, that'd be true. Anybody else? Why is knowing who God is more important? Is it not important to look at what He can do? It's important. Why is it important, though? I mentioned it for our children, but why? Yeah, brother?
It's about relationship.
Yes. Okay. So expound on that.
I mean, if it's relationship is knowing the other person and then knowing you. And if we don't know who God is, we don't have a relationship.
Yes. Have any of you experienced the blessings of God? Yes, we all have. Have you ever found yourself in a place where it seems like the blessings have dried up? The manifest working of God, He seems to have gone foggy, cloudy, He's gotten distant, and you find yourself wondering, where did God go? Have you found yourself there? In those moments when it seems that God goes silent, if all you know is His works, but you don't know who He is, you'll get discouraged, frustrated, and tempted to leave Christianity. So that is why it is so important to know who He is. But guess what? We only know who He is by His works. So what we're going to do here in Psalm 16 is discover what the psalmist describes as the blessings of God. But in understanding the blessings of God, it is to drive us deeper to know who God is. Oswald Chambers put it this way: have we come to the place where God could withdraw His blessings and it does not affect our trust in Him? When once we see God at work, we will never bother our heads about things that happen because we are actually trusting in our Father in heaven, whom the world cannot see. What he is saying there is, know who God is by His blessings, but if He removes the blessings, you still have the Lord. So here's my question for this morning. Do you know the Lord? I'm not asking you primarily, are you saved? Though that could be an applicable question this morning, but likely if this is a Sunday school hour and you are here, probably you're saved. And it is possible there are some who are not saved, and you will get very little from this passage if there has never been a time where you came to realize your need for salvation and you called on Jesus Christ in faith. And so in that case, I am asking, do you know the Lord? But to those who are saved, the question then is, do you know the Lord, the person? Not just His blessings, but the person. The psalmist here is going to, in Psalm 16, draws a constant attention to the common denominator of this psalm, and it's not just the blessings, it is the Lord. But in understanding who the Lord is, we must also understand His blessings. Look with me in verse 1 of Psalm 16. He says this, "Preserve me, O God, for in Thee do I put my trust. O my soul, Thou hast said unto the Lord, Thou art my Lord. My goodness extendeth not to Thee, but to the saints that are in the earth, and to the excellent, in whom is all my delight. Their sorrows shall be multiplied that hasten after another God. Their drink offerings of blood will I not offer, nor take up their names into my lips. The Lord is the portion of mine inheritance and of my cup. Thou maintainest my lot. The lines are fallen unto me in pleasant places. Yea, I have a goodly heritage. I will bless the Lord, who hath given me counsel. My reins also instruct me in the night seasons. I have set the Lord always before me, because He is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad, and my glory rejoiceth. My flesh also shall rest in hope. For Thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt Thou suffer Thine Holy One to see corruption. Thou wilt show me the path of life. In Thy presence is fullness of joy. At Thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore." Do you see the common denominator of Psalm 16? Nearly a dozen times the psalmist points the focus back to Jesus Christ, back to the Lord, because what he is trying to drive home is, if I lose everything else and I can't see anything else, if I have the Lord, it will be enough. It suffices. So the reason I bring that up is because the psalmist here makes it clear, my focus is on Him. So in order to understand who Him is, who He is, let us then look through Psalm 16 and understand the blessings that God gives, which will give us an understanding of who He is, because my greatest goal is to know Him. So look with me in verse 1 of Psalm 16. Clearly the emphasis, the psalm is directing his attention towards Thee. I'm looking to Thee. And so according to verse 1 of Psalm 16, what is it that the psalmist is looking to the Lord for? In other words, what is the blessing of Psalm 16:1? What's the blessing of verse 1 that the psalmist desperately needs in looking to the Lord? What is it that God gives him? Okay, can someone say it a little louder? Preservation. Okay, do we all see that from verse 1? I want you all to see this. He says, "Preserve me, O God, for it's in Thee do I put my trust." So he's saying, I'm not looking to the government. I'm not looking to the stock market. I'm looking to Thee, and what I'm looking to Thee for is preservation. So his focus is on Jesus, and what he needs from Jesus is preservation. Do you ever find yourself in a place where you just need to be preserved? Could I ask you, what is preservation? Could someone define it for me? Because the psalmist says, God preserves me. So what is it that He does? What is preservation? Mrs. Buchanan?
Keeps me alive.
Keeps me alive. Okay, very good. Anybody else want to add to that? What is preservation? If you were going to define it, if a sixth grader came up to you and said, "What's preservation?" How would you define it for them? Okay, all right. Wow, that's very philosophical, but that's good. A maintenance of what is. Okay, which the dictionary definition that I have written down, you're actually hitting that point very well. Anybody else want to add to this? Okay, the Buchanans are about to quiz out here in a minute. Okay, yes, sir?
Complete comfort.
Complete comfort. Okay, yes, certainly. Christ gives comfort. Anybody else? Grace. What is that? Fresh. Okay, you sure? So, well, okay, let me back up and ask this. Any of the ladies, anybody done here any canning? Okay, and it's also called a preserve. What is it that you are doing? All right, you're taking that can, that jar. Brother, you want to?
No, I think it has to do also with like verse 10. It says, "I will not keep corruption."
Yes.
So maybe something that preserves us from that corruption that settles in once we die.
Okay, very good. You're getting it. Let me read you the dictionary definition of preservation. Preservation means to maintain or sustain something in its original or existing state. Okay, so Brother Buchanan, you were getting after it, keeping something fresh. And so what was your name, brother? What is it? Mike. Okay, so what Brother Mike is getting at, so let's use the illustration of canning. Someone takes your mason jar, and you're going to take your beans or your fruit, whatever it is that you're going to can, and the idea of preserving is you take that bean, and you're going to put it inside that mason jar, and you're going to put the liquid in there, and then you're going to pressure seal it with that wax seal, and the idea is that if it's sealed correctly, no contaminants can get inside the jar. And you can take that jar and you can put it on your shelf, and no matter what happens around you, whether it be a storm, a flood, difficulty, whatever happens, that can, as long as the seal is not broken, as long as the outside contaminants don't get into it, it can go for days, weeks, months, even years. And you can go down and take that can off your shelf, regardless of what has happened in your life, crack the can, and it's still in the same state, fresh state, as when you put it in the first day. Are you all tracking with me? See, this is what God is saying. He's saying, I and I alone have the power to preserve you. Do you know, church family, it is not your responsibility to preserve your spirituality? Because you can't. It is a constant looking to thee to say, Father, I am weak, I'm empty, I will fail unless you come through. Lord, I'm casting myself on the preserving, everlasting arms of Jesus, looking to you to do in me what I could never do for myself. Too often when we get saved, we're thankful for Jesus saving us because we couldn't save ourselves, and we look to Him for salvation, and then when it goes into our sanctification, we think it's our responsibility to keep the spiritual power flowing, and it's not, because we can't. You ever heard the old song, I hold not the rock, but the rock holds me? You've heard that song? I hold not the rock, but the rock holds me. The rock what that verse is, what that old spiritual is trying to drive home is, look, your salvation, your sanctification, your assurance of salvation all comes from Jesus, because preserving power only comes from Christ. And yet how often do we find ourselves thinking or concluding that somehow, because of my manliness, my spiritual maturity, whatever it may be, I have to fix my problems? I certainly know, as a young husband and father, my default setting, the most responsible mindset for me, what makes sense to be responsible, is I have to worry and fear and stress, because if I'm not worrying, fearing, and stressing, then I must not be responsible. And what God has begun to teach me, what the psalmist is saying is, I am about to fall apart, and I need the preservation of God only. I need you to put me in that can, pressure seal me, close me up, and guard and protect, so that no matter what happens around me, the Lord is my preservation. Back in, I think it was May of this last year, we were visiting, or we were going to start a meeting with a pastor, and we were coming up to the pastor's house. I'd never met him before. It was our first time, and we were walking up to the pastor's house. And I had my 3-year-old in my arms, and my wife was carrying our daughter, and we're walking up to the house, and as we walk up to the house, the screen door bursts open, and this tiny little dog comes tearing right out at us. And it's a small dog, and so I'm not fearful or worried about it at all, in the least. I can punt it at least 10 yards if I need to. And as he comes streaking out towards us, yip, 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 like that, I'm holding my son in my arms like this, and as soon as that dog begins to run at us, Gilbert, which is my 3-year-old, he begins to clamor and grabbing the side of my head. He's trying to get to high ground. He's trying to get onto my shoulders. And I remember him just like grabbing my face like this as he's trying to climb up as high as he is going. And at this point, my hair is all messed up. And I'm thinking, I'm going to meet this pastor for the very first time. And I've got this little kid strangling me. And finally, we get him calmed down. And the whole time, I'm thinking, this is completely unnecessary for him to be stressing like this. And imagine with me if I placed Gilbert there on the ground after the dog had calmed down, and imagine with me if Gilbert went, "Whoa, Daddy, that was close." Do you know what I would say to Gilbert? It was never close. There wasn't even a chance. Your fear, stress, anxiety, and frustration was completely unwarranted because you were in Daddy's arms. Church family, that is what preservation is. And that's who your God is. As a father, He holds His children. Do you know why you have assurance of salvation? Because He promised, whosoever will. Because He promised, you call unto me and I will save. And He said, you're in my hands. So when I'm struggling with my assurance of salvation, if you struggle with your assurance of salvation, it is not looking to see how good of a Christian have I been, which proves whether or not I'm saved. If that's your measure of your salvation, all of us are going to wonder if we're saved or not.
Yeah.
The measure of your salvation, the assurance of your salvation is in the preserving power that He says, when you called, you're placed into my hands and I have you. And no man can pluck you out. Does He do that just with our salvation? Does He do it for our entire life? Church family, when God tells us, in everything, give thanks. Rejoice in the Lord always. When He tells us those kind of commands, is it because He's just like, well, I don't like complainers and I know everything falls apart for you, but you might as well try to have a good attitude? Is that what He's doing? Or is He saying, I've got it covered, so you can rejoice? I was telling my wife, the Lord has been stirring me about that truth right there. And I told my wife yesterday in the car as we were driving, you know, when the Scripture says, as much as lieth in you, live peaceable with all men, that makes sense in my head. God says, you know, as much as you're able, I know there's times where you can't, but as much as you're able, live peaceably with all men. That makes sense in my head. And when I come to, in everything, give thanks, that doesn't make sense in my head. I think to myself, Lord, there must be a typo. Didn't you mean to say, as much as lieth in you, give thanks? But that's not what He said. He says, in everything give thanks, because I've got you preserved. You're taken care of. Yep. Church family, if we would begin to understand the power of preservation, actually what Brother Mike was getting at down in verse 10, we're going to get to in a minute. Why is, I think it's verse 9. Let me just point this out here. Look at verse 9. Therefore my heart is glad, my glory rejoiceth. Look at this phrase. My flesh also shall rest in hope. Jesus is the only person in the universe that can offer the promise of constant rest. No one else can. No one else has the authority to promise rest, but Christ does because He's a preserving God. Do you know what verse 10 is? Verse 10, what Brother Mike pointed out, I'm going to read it here. Verse 10 says, for thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. That verse is actually, it is a prophetic verse. Peter quotes that verse. I believe it's in Acts chapter 2 or Acts chapter 3. I can't remember which one. But Peter quotes that referring to the Lord Jesus Christ. And what he is pointing to the fact is, look, God can preserve you because He even preserved His Son. And you are embedded in Him, according to Romans chapter 6. So God tells us, if you would look to me in verse 1, you will find me to be a preserving God. Now that, brothers and sisters, ought to put rest in our souls. Because we can rest all things in His hands. Every great man in history, let me back that up. Every great spiritual man in history was not spiritual because he finally figured out how to figure out his problems and fix his problems. Every great man in spiritual history has come to that understanding. Any great biography that you read of a man who knew God, somewhere you will find him coming to an understanding that God can be trusted with my preservation. You ever heard of the name Hudson Taylor? Hudson Taylor, I think most of us know that name. Hudson Taylor was used of God mightily to break into the interior of China back in the 1800s. At that time, the China Inland Mission, there was no such thing, and for a foreign European missionary to go and try to do the things that Hudson Taylor was doing was unheard of. The fact that he would go and dress like the natives and try to reach into the interior. And Hudson Taylor was known to be a man who was driven. He had given himself to working hard for God. He was exhausting his own body, his efforts, his finances. He was giving everything because he took the philosophy, I don't want to rust out, I want to burn out. But the truth is, he finally got to the point after working and struggling and striving for God, he had wasted his health and was lying flat on his back, feeling dejected because his worth had been wrapped up in how much he could do for God. And now he's lying flat on his back, not able to do anything more for God. And God began to speak to him and say, Hudson, don't you realize it's not your faith in me, or excuse me, not your faith in your own faithfulness, but it is your faith in me. It's not about what you can do for me, it's what I can do for you. Hudson, rest. And as Hudson Taylor began to understand that, and he said there, lying flat on his back, he says, I can no longer work for God, but I can trust. When his health was restored and he traveled back to China, the story is told, and if you've ever read his book, Hudson Taylor's Spiritual Secret, his secret was coming to the place where he understood God can be trusted in all points, in all areas, to preserve, which yields rest. The story is told there in his biography that he has several compounds around China where they have European missionaries. He's in a compound near the coast, and there's a compound in the interior. It was right around the time, if I remember correctly, it was around the time of the Boxer Rebellion, and so that interior compound, several hours' journey away, was beginning to be overrun. The natives, the Chinese natives, believed that European missionaries were basically devils incarnate, and so in their thinking they had to destroy all white European missionaries. And so they were beginning to attack that compound, which had dozens of families, missionary families. And so a runner had been sent from the interior compound all the way to the coast to tell Hudson Taylor. And the runner, he runs in breathlessly to Hudson's office. He says, Mr. Taylor, the interior compound, it's being overrun. They'll be massacred before nightfall. And as he turns to walk away, Hudson Taylor, sitting at his desk, begins to whistle, Jesus, I am resting, resting in the joy of what thou art. The runner turns around, comes back into the offices and says, Mr. Taylor, how can you whistle at a time like this? And Hudson turned to him and said, young man, if I was to be anxious or fearful, would it help them any? I know who my God is. And it's on His shoulders to preserve them. See, too often we look at that and we think, that seems lazy. That seems too passive. And I'm not pushing for passivity. What I am pushing for is trust in the preserving power of God. We could spend an entire message on just looking at God's preserving all through the Old Testament, all through the New Testament. And the purpose would be not to just rehearse stories, but to remind us that's not just what God does, that's who He is. Let that sink in. That's my God. That's my Lord. So do you know the Lord? Because He's a preserving God. So he says here, verse 1, preserve me, O God, for in Thee do I put my trust. Now verses 2 and 3, they're challenging verses of Hebrew poetry to understand. Look, I'll read these. O my soul, he says, Thou hast said unto the Lord, Thou art my Lord. My goodness extendeth not to Thee, but to the saints that are in the earth, and to the excellent in whom is all my delight. Now there's a lot of debate about what is my goodness extendeth not to Thee. And honestly, I don't feel like I still fully understand what that phrase is trying to say, but clearly, and commentators will agree, clearly what is being said by verses 2 and verses 3 is that both individually and corporately, if our trust is in Thee, He will take care of us. Now there's more that could be, and honestly, I have pored over those two verses trying to make sense of it all, and I still haven't been able to fully make sense of what it all means, except to say that the attention of the psalmist is still going back to the Lord, and that is enough. He will take care of us. Now look at verse 4. Verse 4 is the only negative verse of the entire psalm. He is drawing a contrast, verses 1, 2, and 3, about who my Lord is, and now he's drawing a contrast to the people who don't know the Lord. Look at verse 4. Their sorrows shall be multiplied that hasten after another God. Their drink offerings of blood will I not offer, nor take up their names into my lips. What the psalmist is clearly saying is, look, those people, those nations who don't have the living and true God, the ones who serve gods of wood and of stone, the idols who, like the prophets of Baal who cried out and he couldn't answer because he is no God, those people, they had the religious rituals, they have the offerings, the blood sacrifices, everything they do is all religious, but it's not to the true God. And this is what he's saying, I want nothing to do with that. Because they live in a constant life of sorrow. Why? Because they don't know who the Lord is. Yeah. Brothers and sisters, we could say that of every single one of your neighbors who are unsaved, their sorrows are multiplied exceedingly, is it not? Because their God is the God of entertainment. Their God is the God of prosperity. Their God is the God of pride and of prowess. And they're pursuing things that will ultimately never satisfy. And in fact, it will not only not satisfy, it will drain the life out of them. And the psalmist is saying, I want nothing to do with that kind of religion. Because it's not to the one true God. And if I was preaching to teenagers, and there have been times where I've taken just that verse and preached to teenagers, and I would challenge them, young people, you can mark it down. There are a few teenagers in here. Young people, you can mark it down. Every single idol that teens lift up. I'm saying the Hollywood icons and the music artist icons, every single one of those who do not know Christ. They look like they have the world by the tail. They look like they have the money. They look like they have the fame. Of course, they have the fame. They look like they have the joy and the pleasure. But the truth is, if you could see behind the scenes, you would find their sorrows are multiplied constantly. Why is it that Johnny Cash, I understand that's not for teenagers, that's for some of the older ones. Why is it that Johnny Cash had to become a drug addict? Why? If you didn't know Johnny Cash was a drug addict, he was. And the reason was, this is what he said, because every night at 5 o'clock, I've got to be happy. What he's meaning is every night when I do a concert, people are expecting me to be happy because that's what I sing about. The lifestyle I'm living is supposed to be happy, and I'm not happy, so in order to stay happy, I have to have a drug addiction to keep up the guise of joy. And I would like to say to Johnny Cash, that is because you're following the wrong God. Why is it that every great teen star that I paid attention to when I was in high school is now coming out in the last 2 years? Every single one of them, whether it be Demi Lovato, Selena Gomez, Miley Cyrus, or Justin Bieber, all those big stars in my teen years that were like the big people, they've all come out in the last couple of years as to reveal they attempted suicide, struggle with depression, because the life that they are living does not pay. Yes. Your sorrows are multiplied. Listen, every man who has pursued a great job, great business, trying to climb the business ladder or make his business into the next Fortune 500, or simply just wants to make a good living, if that's all your goal is, you're pursuing the wrong God. And mark it down, God says, you are heading for sorrows. So let us not make that our goal. And so he says, it is the Lord. Now look at verse 5, and because of time, I'll probably have to end here with verses 5 and 6. My goal was to go through the entire psalm, and you can continue doing that because he keeps pointing the attention back to the Lord. And of course, verse 11, probably one of those well-known verses of Psalm 16, is rich with this. But look at verses 5 and 6. He again, pointing the direction back to the Lord, he says this in verse 5. The Lord is, what's the next phrase? Say it with me. The portion of mine inheritance and of my cup. Okay, that phrase right there helps me. He says, the Lord is the portion of mine inheritance. What is an inheritance? Let me ask you that. If someone can define that for me. We try to define preservation. What's an inheritance? Maybe some of us may think that's pretty simple. I know what an inheritance is, but just throw it out there. What's an inheritance?
Something that's left to you.
Okay. Something that's left to you. Is it something you earned? No. Someone else earned it, worked for it, and it's a rich blessing that's then given to you. Unearned, right? It's just a gift. Okay? So typically when we think of inheritance, we think of in the world of finances or belongings, and that certainly would be appropriate. And he's using this physical picture to try to teach us something very spiritual. Imagine with me, because he uses the word portion, so I want to try to maybe illustrate this. Imagine with me, your parents are filthy rich. They've got several houses around the country, and they've got several cars. Say your dad's been collecting rare cars, old cars. You got a barn full of them, and let's just say your mom's got maybe a rare dish collection that she's been collecting, and she's got this fancy stamp collection, and maybe a fancy Afghan collection. I don't know what ladies collect, but I know guys, we collect cars and guns and things like that. And imagine your parents, they just have it all. They've got the stock market, they've got everything that they want, and they're on their deathbed, they're ready to die, and they know it. And so they call you and your siblings into their hospital room, and they say, okay, we're going to portion out our estate. Before they've got the lawyer there, we're going to write out our last will and testament, and we want all our kids there. We want you to know, what would you like of our inheritance, because we're going to portion it out, and so you can pick your portion of the inheritance that you get when we pass away. So imagine with me, your mouth starts to water and you think, oh man, this is great. Okay, that rare car collection, man, I've always admired that Ford Mustang there, 64. I mean, okay, if I could get that collection, and okay, maybe if I could get his gun collection, which house am I going to, maybe if I could get the house and the keys. And so you're thinking like, you'd like to take it all, but you can't, because you can't be selfish. You got to let your siblings have some of it. And so you finally decide, okay, if you're the oldest, you get the pick of the litter. You're saying, okay, if I could just get this house, this part of the collection, and this amount of your money, of your estate settled and given to me, if I could get those things, that would be enough. Now, let me ask you, would it be enough? And I think we all recognize that. No, it would never be enough. After you got it and you lived in the house, you'd realize what the taxes are. You have all the old cars, you realize what the parts cost for that and what the excise tax. After a while, you'd realize, man, maybe this is not as much of a blessing as we thought. But anyways, you'd come to the conclusion that this wealth, these blessings, they don't satisfy. Every great man in history who has ever earned a lot of money came to that conclusion, whether he admitted it publicly or not. Rockefeller did. When someone asked him, so how much is enough wealth, he was quoted to have said, just a little bit more. Because he is helping us see, Rockefeller is, that if you got the wealth, it wouldn't be enough. So this is what the psalmist is saying. If my portion could be the Lord, it would be enough. Do you realize that David, the psalmist, was not getting much physical wealth from his dad? When David is running from Saul, his father and mother join him in his vagabond lifestyle because they also are running from Saul. So if there was anything left in the Jesse estate, if his older brothers didn't take it all, it doesn't seem like there's much left for David. But at least he married into the kingly line. Oh yeah, except his father-in-law wants to kill him. When it comes to physical inheritance, it does not seem, when David has come to the age of 28 years old, he's running from Saul, and the kingship, though he's been anointed, the kingship is very far away, and he's not even sure if he's ever going to see it. He's come to the conclusion, I'm not going to receive anything in this physical world, but oh Lord, if I could have you. May I ask us as we conclude here this morning, have you found Jesus to be enough? That is the driving question. It's the question of this entire week. Do you know who the Lord is? Because if you are living in anxiety, frustration, regular fear, regular worry, it means there's something about Christ that you don't know yet. There's something about His person, there's something about His nature that you've not come to rest in, because if you are living in a lack of rest, it's because you don't know who the Lord is and you're looking for something else to satisfy. And the psalmist said, if I could have Jesus, He is my portion and it's enough. I think probably all of us, to that question, is Jesus enough? We could all, amen. Could I ask you though, do you ever find yourself supplementing Jesus because we're not sure if He's enough of a portion? I have. Have you? Entertainment is an easy one. It's so accessible today. It's on our phones. It's in our home if you have a television. It's on your computer if you have Wi-Fi. It's everywhere. Leonard Ravenhill one time said, entertainment is the devil's substitute for joy. Isn't it so true, though, that when we are down, frustrated, empty, and discouraged, what do? We often run to entertainment. I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus, but what I have found in my experience is that when an older person gets to the place where they do not feel like they have a good quality of life, they will spend hours in a day, in fact, the majority of a day, sitting in front of a television because that's all they have to keep them entertained. And oftentimes, a person who lives that way will find they go to their deathbed backslidden because Jesus hasn't been enough. I was talking on the phone just last week with a lady. She's an invalid. She's been in her home now for several years. But every day when she rises, and this lady really is quite a phenomenal lady, she rises and she sits in her chair, and she sits in that chair all day long except for going up and getting food. But she spends her time in prayer, in singing, in reading devotionals. And I'm sure she takes some time to check the news. I'm sure it's not an evil thing to check the news, but she's not living for it. I'm sure there's been a time where she's probably watched a television show. There's nothing wrong with watching a television show, but she's not looking to that for her satisfaction. And as she called me on the phone simply to pour out all the blessings that Christ has been pouring upon her, and she just couldn't contain it. And she said, I've just got to tell somebody about how good God is. And I thought, you're an invalid and you're thinking that? That means she knows something about Jesus that I need to know. What I'm saying, church family, is if we would find Him to be our portion, He's deeper, fuller, sweeter than anything that TNT, AMC, PBS, Fox, certainly CNN, can give to you. And that's just one application of substituting Christ. Maybe you say, I don't have a TV, I don't have internet, I don't even have a smartphone. Man, I don't have to do that. But you find your joy in something other than what flows from Christ. And let us all say, now, Father, show me, Lord, where I've gotten distracted from finding my all in Thee. I'm not saying, church family, that everything you do has to be laced with Bible verses, but what I am saying is that you're yielded to the Spirit, you're looking to Him, you're rejoicing constantly in His goodness for you, where at any given moment, if someone stops you, they could ask you a reason of the hope which is in you with meekness and fear, and it's not hard to just pour forth Christ. Because He flows through you, and He is enough. Verse 6 says, the lines, this is the portion, they're falling to me in pleasant places. I have a goodly heritage. Verse 11, you show me the path of life. In Thy presence is fullness of joy. At Thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. Church family, as we conclude this time, here's what I would encourage us to do. Lord, I want to know fullness of joy. Lord, I want to know pleasures forevermore. And so far, the CMA Awards haven't given me that. Watching the Emmys hasn't given me that. Watching Jay Leno hasn't given me that. Lord, I want to find fullness of joy. Just restoring that car so I can have a cool car, that didn't do it for me. Lord, buying that new countertop, that new washer and dryer that I thought was going to so satisfy and it didn't. Lord, I want to know deeper. That's what this week is all about. Lord, take me deeper. Would you show me where I'm supplementing? Show me my wrong perspective of you. Lord, teach me who you are. And we will find Christ to be enough.